When the wild dog Sandy came into our life, we were living west of Antlers, Oklahoma, on a dirt road that was 1 mile north of the Darwin store, which was the Pushmataha, Atoka County line, and at the time the store was still there and open for business, though it's been long gone for years now. I believe it was 1960 when we lived there, and I was 12 years old. The dirt road only ran a mile or two west, parallel to U.S. Highway number 3, to the rock house that the Durant Franks family lived in, and there was a big sawmill there also. I believe the sawmill may have been owned by the Lane family. There were only 3 families on the dirt road we lived on. My family, L.C. and Florine Ratliff, lived at the east end of the road. Then on the west end there was L.J. and Tidy Ruth Steely's family. And in the last house to the west, Miss Sandage lived. And all the houses were on the north side of the road. Miss Sandage, I think, lived by herself because I don't remember seeing anyone else there the few times I was at her house. I remember she had some tame rabbits in a hutch out back, and she let me and my brother Chuck feed the rabbits every once in a while. L.J. and Tidy Ruth lived in the middle house. Their family and our family were always friends, and us kids were pretty much raised up together. The Steely kids were Rusty, that's Buster Bell of Antlers, Oklahoma, Ricky, Linda Ruth, and Mitch. Rusty and my brother Chuck were the same age, about 10 at the time, and they were best friends who later went to Vietnam together. Another family who was always around with their kids visiting the Steelys were Dub and Margaret Hammonds. Their kids were Marilyn, she was my age, Joe, Margie, J.R., and Stanley. My family consisted of my parents plus myself, Lonnie Carl, Chester Allen, Shirley Ann, Jerry Don, and Gary Wayne. Our family's old shack was about a half a mile east of the Steelys. I don't remember many highlights about living there except we had to carry drinking water because the well had alum in it. It was like biting into a green persimmon, it was so bitter. I remember my dad traded cars with his brother Eldon Ratliff and ended up with this beautiful 1949 Black Mercury for some old junky looking car we had. About a month later, the Mercury threw a rod. The other thing I remember was my cousin Barbara Sue Finley, Barbara Sue Bell now, came over and stayed all night with us a couple of times. I thought she was as pretty as any movie star. She was probably about 16, and she had one of those fringy black and white pinto vests. I figured out after I got a little older that she was staying with us so she could sneak out on a date with one of Son Henson's boys, who apparently she was pretty sweet on. But Uncle Milton and Aunt Ollie Finley were not all that wild about them dating. Mom and Dad must have been part of the conspiracy. I was the only one who thought Barbara Sue was just coming over to see me and the family. Another thing that stands out was that Carl Massey, he was kind of a Huck Finn type character. He was a couple of years older than me, and I always looked up to him. He was out hunting and he killed a possum, but it turns out the possum wasn't dead. He was just playing dead, and it ended up biting Carl's hand. When he came walking past our house, my mom saw his hand was bleeding, so she brought him in the house, and all us kids watched as she took care of Carl's hands. I remember being so proud of her for fixing my friend's bleeding hand up, and I also remember for disinfectant she poured kerosene that we used for lights on Carl's hand and tore up an old bed sheet for a bandage. Now that you're acquainted with the characters, I will get on with the story about the wild dog Sandy, as best I remember it. Keep in mind this story's been told by someone who lets the water boil away and burns up the pan about every third or fourth batch of eggs I try to boil. My dad, L.C. Ratliff, along with L.J. Steely, Dub Hammonds, and probably Terry Don Poff, had gone hunting up around Cloudy, Oklahoma, near Medicine Springs. This was a little out of character for them, as none were really the Davy Crockett type, so I suspect it was just an excuse to go out drinking together. But obviously they were out in the woods at some time because they found a wild dog caught in a steel trap. that must have been some kind of adventure getting that dog out of a steel trap, because he was one big mean dog. Since they were probably half lit, I'm surprised the dog didn't kill some or all of them. Madison Springs is way back in the boonies, and no one lived for miles around there, so they figured the dog was just wild and living like a coyote or wolf out in the woods. I'm not sure exactly what went into the thought process, but instead of just letting the wild dog go, they decided to bring it home. Don't know how it was decided that our family would be the proud new owners, but somehow it was, and I will never forget the first time I ever saw Sandy with a log chain around his neck in the back of a pickup. He was growling and snapping at anyone or anything that got close, and I've always imagined if the devil has a dog, it must have been exactly that wild dog Sandy. The men tied the wild dog to the corner of our house, and we were now owners of probably the most vicious animal in Atoka County. It is hard to figure people out, and especially when you are only 12 years old, but my mom seemed so drawn to this wild dog for some strange reason. I think she was even the one who named him Sandy, which kind of made sense because of his sandy reddish color. Looking back, she may have not liked him all that much at first, but was just trying to tame him down so he didn't kill none of us kids. Every day she'd take Sandy something to eat, and that devil dog would lunge at her, and at first she would have to put his food in a bowl and use a long stick to push it close enough for him to eat it. Then Mom just sat out of reach and talked to that crazy dog like she was carrying on a conversation with a sane person. I have no idea what she talked about, because I was not getting close enough to them to hear the conversation. My curiosity ends at about the same place I felt my life is endangered. If I could have figured out a way, I would have let that dog loose in a minute. To this day, I don't understand why my mom in the beginning didn't just tell my dad to get rid of him. Dad never did seem to ever get too attached to him, and later on, when my dad tried to whip my brother Jerry for something he did, Sandy gave him a warning growl, and that was the end of the planned whipping. I think my dad become about half afraid of him, so from then on, he just cut him a wide berth. No, there was never any doubt that the wild devil dog was my mom's dog. Mom continued her conversations with Sandy while he gulped down his meals, and he seemed to get a little calmer every day. In about 2 or 3 weeks, she would walk up to him, and without him trying to jerk the house off the foundations. Then one day, Mom decided it was time she introduced Sandy to us kids. I can't remember if we had to wear our Sunday best. Probably not, but nevertheless, it was a solemn event for my mom, and the first time in my life it had ever crossed my mind to question the sanity of a grown-up's decision on anything, especially a parent's sanity. Well, Mom walked us out there for the formal introduction, and I remember thinking, I hope none of my friends hear about this. That was one of my concerns, but my main concern was I wondered if any of us will survive if that crazy-ass dog breaks loose. 50 years later, looking back, it still is pretty strange. My mama stood there and introduced each one of us kids to that dog like he was a Sunday school teacher or some other person we needed to get to know and make a good impression on. Then she patted his head and she said, Sandy, these are my babies, so be good to them, and that was that. I remember Sandy stayed chained up for a while longer, and then without any fanfare, he was loose and playing with us kids like he had never been a killer from hell. He tolerated the little kids pulling his ears and tail like he had been raised by us from a puppy. The last thing that stands out in my mind about Sandy was one day my mom was visiting with Tidy Ruth. All us kids were outside playing, and us older kids were supposed to be keeping the little kids out of the road, but doing a pretty poor job of it. So every once in a while, either Mom or Tidy Ruth would come running out of the house and grab a little kid right before he got out to the road. Old Sandy was watching all this, and he must have figured out what needed to be done, and from then on, whenever a little kid got too close to the road, Sandy would just go grab it by the diaper, drag it kicking and screaming back to safety. He'd come a long way from being a wild dog in a steel trap to an unpaid babysitter.